before you get the idea that evolution happened not long before I was born, say 90 years before I was born, that they finally came up with a theory. There have been various kinds of evolutionary theories that have been going on for thousands of years, literally thousands of years. I'm going to show you a few just from the ancient Greek times, all right? There was a guy named Thales, sometimes Thales of Miletus. He said that he began with a single material cause. Water was the single material cause, which in turn developed into other elements. He held that these elements first developed into bodies of plants and then simpler animals and finally into more complex forms such as human. This was 640 or so BC, which would be 26, almost 2,700 years ago. All right? Another guy that was Greek believed in the existence of a primordial mass that perpetually gave off a series of shapes of matter which resolved themselves into plant forms, and these in turn resolved themselves into animal forms of ever-increasing complexity. He thought that man evolved from fish forms. A student of his said that the primordial mass was an all-generating air. What does that remind you of? Something always had to be. Like I said that the kid in high school that my brother and I knew said that ether always was. Some people say other things always were. This ancient Greek guy, 2,600 years ago, thought that there was an all-generating air. Another one. The four basic elements of earth, fire, water, and air supposedly formed masses underground which were cast onto the surface. So imagine this. A barn is forming under the ground, and over here there's a head forming under the ground, and over here there's a torso, and over here there's a leg, and they pop up and they come together and they make humans. What part of that follows the Bible? Man was made of dirt. Okay? Can you see how some of these, number one, we'll go through a couple more, follow a little bit, in other words, evolution today follows a little bit of what they thought back then, but also these follow a little bit, in some ways, of things that were said in the Bible when it was first written or it was first done thousands of years before. For instance, water being the first main material cause, okay? Isn't that what Genesis says? Man being made of earth, isn't that what Genesis says? And then he went on to say that, in other words, man was formed from dust of the ground and the parts somehow assembled themselves. So I think a lot of the theories that have come up that are non-God, even the ones where there are other ancient religions, came from distortions of what God had originally done. And when we look at it that way, I think it's a simpler understanding, and we're going to talk about that starting in the next couple of weeks. Here's another one. This guy, Democritus, was an atomist. The atoms were uncaused and existed from eternity. All right? I don't agree with the fact that the atoms existed from eternity, but there was something that did exist from eternity. We're told in the Bible that personality was God, but there are atoms, which he couldn't see in a microscope, but he actually envisioned that there was something like that. The atoms were uncaused and from eternity. They were different shapes, but the same substance, a material matter which always existed. So now we're back to the evolutionary idea, modern evolutionary idea that matter always existed. But again, they know that there was a beginning to the universe because had to have been a big bang because of how things are. You see how this is all convoluted and kind of everybody coming back with the same kinds of theories over and over and over again? This is not new like you would think it is. All right? Some of these ideas lasted from late ancient times until more recent modern times, but with the advent of the scientific revolution, that would have happened starting in the late 15 and then 16 and 1700s, all right, several hundred years ago. None of the ancient theories could stand the test of the new modern sciences. So now we've got these guys, all right, Robert Boyle, Blaise Pascal, Sir Isaac Newton, Francis Bacon, and a lot of other ones. A lot of these guys were important back into about the 16 and 1700s. This is where the real scientific revolution started. But in this particular period of time, guys like the ones you see on the screen right here made discoveries that would change the world. But all of these men believed in something that many scientists don't today. Any idea what that is? God. In fact, there are some that say the only reason why they made such great scientific advances is because they realized that the earth was not random, and that if God that they believed in created the universe, that he did it in such a way that they could discover it. That's important. They believed in a mind that designed things rather than random chance. And that led them to know that they could discover God's designs. But other scientists during the same time were atheists. There were quite a few. And were looking for a scientific reason not to believe. In other words, it wasn't just that they woke up one day and didn't believe. They were actively trying to counter these guys and say there has to be a way to scientifically show that these guys are wrong in their premise that God created things, therefore we can discover it. They wanted actively, and they tried actively to figure out a way to show that there wasn't a God, but they didn't have a mechanism because the ancient ones that came from the Greeks were all nonsense, according to the scientific revolution. So, we're going to start with this guy, Erasmus Darwin. These conditions led to men like Erasmus, 1730s to the early 1800s, who was one of England's most famous evolutionists. His son was a guy named Robert Darwin. He was a medical doctor, and he was also an atheist. Robert Darwin married Susanna Wedgwood, and she was a Unitarian. So now we've got an atheist who doesn't believe in God married to a Unitarian who does. Now, I don't agree with a lot of the Unitarianism's religious beliefs, okay? They believed in God, but they didn't believe that Jesus was God. And there's some other things that I think that they were wrong on. But the point is that when you get to the next generation, that's Charles Darwin's father and grandfather. And along the top here, you see atheist, and along the bottom here, you see Unitarian. Do you think that Darwin was subjected to both worlds? Both the atheistic worlds that didn't believe in God and the world that did believe in God? Absolutely. Okay? Absolutely. So much so that their son, Charles Darwin, was baptized as a baby in 1809. And was subjected to both belief in God and to atheism. And by age 22, you know what Darwin's plan was? He was going to be a preacher. He was studying to be a clergyman. All right? Going with his grandmother and his mother's side more than his father's. His father didn't like it because his father wanted him to be a doctor. When Darwin walked onto the HMS Beagle, HMS, anybody know what that stands for? We have the USS What's that one that's parked in New York? Aircraft carrier. I forget the name. USS, of course, stands for United States, etc. HMS does stand for something. Her Majesty's Service. Okay, so it's British. HMS Beagle, his goal was not to disprove God or to prove evolution. He was simply there because he had an opportunity to gather biological information. And this was in 1831. Charles Darwin was asked to sail on a ship, the Beagle, and he was hired to be the ship's naturalist. All right, he had some medical type training, some scientific training from his father. He had the opportunity of a lifetime, go on a 5-year tour around the world. This actually literally went around the world. And his job was to get animals, to write notes, to look at landscapes, anything that he can, document it, and bring it back. That was his job for 5 years. Most of the trip was spent sailing around South America. They spent a lot of time around the Galapagos Islands, where Darwin spent considerable time on shore collecting plants and animals. Darwin filled many notebooks with observations of plants, animals, and geology. The trip lasted nearly 5 years, and the Beagle went back to England and came back in October of 1836. He didn't write his Origin of Species until around 1860 something. Can't remember the exact date right this second. All right, and this is basically where they sailed. And those go South America. They spent a lot of time down in this area around Cape Horn. They spent a lot of time over in those Galapagos Islands there at the left. Throughout South America, he gathered a lot of a variety of bird specimens. One key observation that Darwin made while he was studying the specimens on the Galapagos Islands was this right here. You have several different kinds, and he actually had more than just these 4, but several different kinds of finches, all with different beak sizes. That kind of fascinated him. He noticed that on the various islands, some finches had this side of beak on this island, and on a different island they had a different sized beak, and over here they had a different sized beak, but they all seemed to have migrated from the mainland. Okay, from South America coast. But they all showed different characteristics that helped them eat food more easily in their specific habitat. He collected many specimens of these finches, made many drawings in his notebooks, and provided Darwin with records of his observation. His goal was to record these animals and their life. That's what he was hired to do. From his observations, Darwin supposed that these kinds of finches all had diverged from one source. Later, he would give natural selection the credit for producing different sized beaks. Natural selection is what Darwinism is all about right now. Okay? Over the years, this has become the gold standard theory, so to speak, of evolution. And like the giant fish that got away story, you remember hearing about or hearing someone tell the story of a fish, and every time they tell how they caught this fish, the fish gets bigger and bigger and bigger. This particular story about Darwin is the most famous. Everybody worships almost, I hate to say it, these finches. Now they call them Darwin's finches. That's what the name of it is. It grows with every telling. In fact, after around 1947, which is 110 years after Darwin, Darwin was given credit for finches that he never saw and observations that he never made. Because the story just grew like the fish story. Now, enter the 1970s. I'm just out of high school at this time. All right? Trying to give you a little bit of timeline at the same time. 1970s enters these two people, the Grants, Peter and Rosemary Grant. They went to the Galapagos Islands and did extensive research on Darwin's finches. And they did it with good intentions, okay? Even a creationist nowadays looks at these guys, they're evolutionists, okay? They believe in evolution, but the things they found were actually useful. But there's some flaws in how they've been interpreted, and that's what I want to deal with here for a second. They banded pretty much all of the finches on one of the small islands and then banded others on other islands and studied them for nearly 40 years. Kept going back every year or so to the Galapagos Islands, finding those same fishes that they put bands around their feet and finding their offspring and banding them and kept keeping very detailed records. And they did this for a lot of years. At one point, they found that the beak size of these finches were getting bigger. Don't you think that would be like a big thing for the evolutionists to catch on to? And it kind of was. One of their conclusions was that they were seeing evolution happen in a very short period of time. But there was a catch if you studied it. What had caused this increase in beak size, you'll never guess what it was. There was a drought. What did that mean? That means that there was less food. What does that mean? Well, that means that a lot of finches started dying. Well, there was some food, but the seeds that were available during the drought were bigger seeds. So which ones of the finches survived the drought better? The ones with bigger beaks. Okay? The bigger beak sizes. As the years went on, they noticed that there was a lack of water in the fish, and the finches' food supply became scarce. Now, this right here, because of these observations, evolutionists suppose that these kinds of droughts took place if they took place every few years, the eventual thing that would happen was that beak size of finches would keep getting bigger and bigger. This is the data they had in the 1970s. If you know how to read a graph, what does that mean? That means that during the time of the Grant's observation, beak sizes went up by 5%. Okay? So, what does a science or a math person do when they see a trend? You remember from any of your math classes? They extrapolate. You know what that means?
To go to those?
Huh?
I was supposed to go to those?
You were probably there, but that doesn't mean you were.
Not in most of them.
Okay. You know what extrapolate means? That means we're going to see what trend it is and we're going to follow that same path and see where it'll lead. So this is where it led. And they actually did this. They figured that those beak sizes, every so often there'd be a drought. Beak sizes would get bigger, then there'd be a drought, and those beak sizes would get bigger, and then there would be another drought, and beak sizes. And then by the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, or whatever, the beak sizes, you'd end up with what they might call an elephant finch. Had a really big beak. All right? Unfortunately, that's not what really happened. As the years went on and more droughts went, they actually observed some of the evidence, and the beak sizes did not continually grow. Instead, they did this, the green line. When the droughts came, the beak sizes went up, and when the droughts were gone and the rainy season came, the beak sizes went back down to normal. So it was on what they call a swing curve. It didn't continually grow, which is counter to what evolution would tell us would happen. Very counter. If you look at this scientifically and mathematically, this doesn't disprove evolution, because like we said from the very beginning of this class, you can't absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt prove there's a God, and you can't absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt prove that evolution is true. You can only look at the evidence. Look at look at what they thought, and look at the evidence. This shows it's highly unlikely that this was an evolutionary process. Okay? That's important. Now we're going to take about 4 minutes and we're going to watch Jonathan Wells explain his take on this, because this is one of the things he talks about in his book that we've been mentioning, Icons of Evolution. All right? 4 minutes.
We do have good evidence of natural selection in the wild, Darwin's finches. These are species of finch that look very similar to each other, except mainly for the size and shapes of their beaks. They live on the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador, Pacific. And about 25 years ago, some biologists from Princeton University, Peter and Rosemary Grant, studied one species of finch, the median ground finch, on one of the little islands in the Galapagos. And the study was extremely careful. I mean, they went and banded birds, identified virtually every bird on the island, kept lineages of who was born to whom, what the birds ate. And a stroke of good fortune for the Grants, although not for the birds, was that in 1977 there was a severe drought, which destroyed most of the food supply, killed 85% of the birds in this population. And the Grants found that of those that remained, the average beak size was about 5% larger. So the drought had killed preferentially birds with smaller beaks, left larger beaks because the larger beaks were better at cracking the few hard seeds that had survived the drought. So we have here a 5% increase in the space of 1 year. Well, some people, some textbooks in fact, extrapolate that and point out that, well, if we had a drought, say, every 10 or 20 years, you could have a 100% increase in the size of the beak in a very short time, evolutionarily speaking. And this could account for why we have different species with different beak sizes in the finches in the Galapagos. The problem is, when we look at the actual evidence, as soon as the rain returned, the average beak size in these finches went back to normal, and has oscillated about that value ever since. There is no net evolutionary change here, but merely swings back and forth depending on the climate. Very few textbooks point this out in their story of Darwin's finches. In fact, here is a statement from the National Academy of Sciences, sadly, that Darwin's finches are a particularly compelling example of speciation, that is, the origin of new species. No new species originated here, but yet it's being claimed this is a compelling example of speciation because a single year of drought drove evolutionary change. And if this occurred once every 10 years, a new species of finch might arise in only about 200 years. No mention whatsoever of the fact that the change was completely reversed in the following years. So Darwin's finches do provide good evidence of natural selection in the wild, but the small reversible effects that were observed have been exaggerated to give the impression that they show more than they really do. What we really see here are small oscillations within a species, not the origin of species that Darwin needs. Now, the one critic of Darwinism, I've quoted several critics of Darwinism, but the one person who could be considered a creationist I'm quoting here today, Philip Johnson, a law professor at Berkeley, wrote in 1999 in the Wall Street Journal, something that I think a law professor is qualified to write. That is, if stock promoters had done this to their customers, they would land in jail. And yet, our leading scientist, the National Academy of Science, has resorted to the sort of distortion that would land these stock promoters in jail. Well, I think this is a sad commentary on the state of science now. It seems to me that scientists, if anything, should be more honest than a stock promoter. Certainly not less.
So, anybody remember the name Bernie Madoff? Might be just a little bit before your time. He was a real famous guy that was making supposedly tons and tons and tons of money for people that had a lot of money, and he was investing it, blah, blah, blah. And what they found out was he was not doing what he said. He was misrepresenting what was going on. He made a lot of money for himself, and all these other people lost money. This is kind of a common practice sometimes, all right? My brother actually knew somebody that did that, and he's in jail now for it. And what this guy's saying at the end here is that when you're a stockbroker and you misrepresent what it is that you say is actually happening when you know that it's not, you land in jail. But when you're a scientist and you do the same thing, you get published in major magazines and scientific journals and become famous. Even though they know that's not what this data says. You see, there are no indications at all that finches turned into anything else but a finch. You see how they're dangling something that looks like it might be evolution, and the facts say that it's actually not happening, and that in the end, you're not changing from one species to another. But yet, like I said before, Darwin's finches, Darwin's finches, still in the science books. They know better, but they gotta say something or the theory looks stupid. Okay? Any questions on that before we move to one more today? Oh, by the way, these are pictures of finches that I took in my backyard. I like finches, they're kind of cool. And I found out something with this one. This was kind of odd. That's a male and a female finch. And I found out that they're not just kissing. It's kind of gross, actually. When the female is pregnant, the male goes and gets the food, which he did from my bird feeder, chews it up a little bit, and feeds the female. In fact, there were a couple of the shots where I had like slime coming down from her beak, and I thought, no, that's not as pretty, so I didn't show that one. But you can see that these different finches here not only are a little bit different in their shape, but they have different sized beaks. Okay, so it's not an unusual thing. All right, let's move on. There's a guy named Ernst Haeckel. Ever heard of him? Probably not. All right. He was a German and an embryologist living in the 1830s to the 1919, almost the 1920. Haeckel was one of those guys. He was a zoologist and he was an evolutionary biologist that wanted to try to prove all those guys I showed you before, Newton, Bacon, all those guys, that they were wrong, that they could figure out a way to show that you didn't need the Bible and you didn't need God to have life and to have the universe that we see. That was one of his main goals in his life. He was known for his depiction of evolution of embryos. You know what an embryo is? It's like the tiny form of a baby before it's born, all right? The drawings that he made of these embryos at the early stages made them all look as if they were similar with each other, which showed to him, and he tried to promote and succeeded to promote, that they all came from a common ancestor. The embryos supposedly showed that amphibians, reptiles, birds, humans, etc., all descended from fish-like. That's what this chart shows. So on the far end, from left to right, at the bottom down there, you're going to see the embryo of a fish, a salamander, a turtle, a chicken, a pig, a calf, a rabbit, and then finally on this side, a human. And if you go up to the top here, what he drew made them all look so that they all look the same in the beginning, and they grew up to be different as they became larger and eventually were born. To many at this time, this proved that all creatures had evolved from a common ancestor. Good theory. But there was another German embryologist named von Baer. And he disagreed because he did his own experiments and found out that what Haeckel had drawn was wrong. This is more like what Baer saw. So that, and you'll see this in a second, this is the stage right here that Haeckel was talking about. It's down here. Haeckel said this was the earliest stage. Well, look at here. Von Baer says, no, there's 5 stages before that. They don't look anything like it at these stages, and they don't look like Haeckel's at this stage. All right? The problem is, Baer was a very respected scientist, but Haeckel was out there promoting himself so that science would listen to him because the scientific community was thirsty at the time for an idea that could show evolution was true. So even though Baer showed them what was actually going on, they ignored it. Baer was angry not only because they did that, but because Haeckel used Baer's name in reference to these. And Baer didn't believe it at all. In other words, he flat out lied. That's a matter of record. This is a little thing that shows von Baer comparative embryologies. You notice that top row right there? It looks just like Haeckel's. Even though this was Baer's, this is what they promoted as being Baer's in the 1800s. They lied about it. They flat out lied about it. There are many problems with what Ernst Haeckel did with his drawings. And what I want to do here is, because it gets a little bit complex, I want to show another video that tells it better than I can. This is, again, Jonathan Wells, the same guy that wrote that book. This one's a little longer, it's 8 minutes. All right? And when we're done with that, we're going to be just about done with the class. So try to pay attention to this one, because he can explain it better than I can.
Finally, for descent with modification, we come to the story of vertebrate embryos, my favorite because I'm an embryologist. Darwin was aware of the fossil problem. He knew nothing about molecules at that point, and he knew that homology had not, although he considered it a product of common ancestry, he couldn't prove it. He knew that he didn't have the mechanism nailed down the way one would have to nail it down to make it evidence. So for Darwin himself, what I'm about to show you was by far the strongest single class of facts in favor of his theory of common ancestry. This is it. These were drawings made by German Darwinian Ernst Haeckel while Darwin was alive. And these drawings show embryos of various classes of vertebrates, animals with backbones. On the far right, if you look at the bottom row, you'll see a human fetus, 3 other mammals next to it. Then you'll see a chick moving to the left, a turtle, a salamander, and a fish. That's the bottom row. Now, if you look up at the top row, you'll see that these different classes look virtually identical in what Haeckel is portraying as their earliest stage. And for Darwin, this was powerful evidence that these animals all share a common ancestor. Because they start out looking identical as embryos, not only did they share a common ancestor, Darwin was convinced that the common ancestor actually looked something like this embryonic form. The problem is, Haeckel faked his drawings. There's no nicer way to put it. In 1998, in Science, the journal Science, these photographs were published. Actually, people knew at the time, in 1870, that Haeckel faked his drawings. But just recently, it came out again. When this was published in Science, these are photographs of actual embryos, and you can see the top row there with the red box around it. These are photographs of various vertebrates at the stage Haeckel chose as his first. And you can see just by the naked eye that they're easily distinguishable from each other. If we focus just on the classes Haeckel chose, he had 5 classes in his drawing: fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Haeckel's drawings are at the top. Drawings taken from pictures of actual embryos are in the middle with the red box around. And you can see for yourself that these are distinguishable, and how much Haeckel fudged or distorted or faked his drawings to fit the theory he was trying to prove. The man who published the pictures in Science 3 years ago wrote the year before, "It looks like this is turning out to be one of the most famous fakes in biology." Just last year, Stephen Jay Gould wrote in Natural History, "We do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not a majority, of modern textbooks."
Gould is an
And
evolutionist.
unfortunately, they're still there.
He's saying this.
Here's Haeckel's drawings, straight from Haeckel, in Doug Patuma's Evolutionary Biology, the book I used as a graduate student at Berkeley. Another book, this book is for high school students, Miller and Levine, Biology, the 2000 edition, doesn't use Haeckel's drawings, but a slightly redrawn version. The top row you can see is drawn to look virtually identical, although at least the fish is given a different color and different size. But these are still highly stylized and don't fit those photographs that I showed you from Science. And yet this is being claimed as evidence for evolution. But it turns out that distorting vertebrate embryos at the stage Haeckel chose as his first really isn't the most serious part of the problem. Because if we look, remember the argument was that because the earliest stages are similar, these animals share a common ancestor. If we actually look at the earliest stages of vertebrate embryos, they look even more different. Here in the green box, you can see the first few cell divisions in the 5 classes I just showed you. I won't go into detail here, but the cleavage patterns here are radically different. If we move to the stage where the cells begin to move to form the shape of the embryo, the cell movements and the patterns they form are again radically different. So the earliest stages are even more different than the actual embryos at the stage Haeckel labeled as first. So much so that developmental biologists have taken to calling this pattern the developmental hourglass, in which the embryos at the top are very different. They converge somewhat in appearance toward the middle, the red circle in the middle, which is the stage Haeckel chose as his first. And then they diverge again as they approach birth or adulthood. So if we look at that middle stage there that Haeckel chose as his first, of the 5 embryos there, 2 of them, the chick and the human, resemble each other at least vaguely. Right? If we ignore the other 3, we've got at least 2 of those 5 at that particular middle stage that look somewhat similar. And lo and behold, in Campbell, Reese, and Mitchell, those are the 2 that are chosen. Now here we have actual photographs, not fake photos. But as you can see, this textbook has chosen only those 2 embryos out of that whole pattern I showed you a minute ago that happen to look most similar, and claims that at this early stage of development, the kinship of vertebrates is unmistakable. Another textbook that I'm talking about here, Autosirk and Byers, has this picture with the statement that embryological stages of animals can provide evidence of common ancestry. For example, all vertebrate embryos look quite similar to one another in early development. Well, again, you can see that they've chosen the chick and the mammal. Curiously, they've also added a turtle. Well, funny, if you look at the turtle, you can tell it's a turtle. It really doesn't look similar at all. So the picture, in a sense, puts the lie to the statement in the text. But if you recall from the earlier diagram, the amphibians and the fish look even more different from the turtle. And so even here, there's a careful selection of evidence to fit the theory. And again, the earlier stages are ignored. An embryologist writing 25 years ago wrote, "It is only by semantic tricks and subjective selection of evidence, which we've just seen with our very eyes, by bending the facts of nature, that one can argue that the earliest stages of vertebrate embryos are more similar than their adults." So here we have three icons of evolution: Darwin's tree of life, homology of vertebrate limbs, and vertebrate embryos, which supposedly provide overwhelming evidence that permits no other conclusion than the common ancestry of the major groups of animals and even the vertebrates within that. And yet all three of these icons distort or even fake the actual evidence.
And in the biology book I have here that I've been showing you, they did take out the original Haeckel's drawings. And just like he said in one of his biology books, they left in the chicken and the person because they actually do in real life look similar. They didn't put the photographs. They drew their own. But they make the same conclusion. They make the same conclusion as they have with all of the embryos that were wrong, but they only use the two that look somewhat similar. So they don't have the problem of people asking, how come the drawing doesn't look like the real thing? Okay, but they're still indoctrinating the same idea and misleading the public. So I asked Google AI the following question: do embryos show evolution? And they'll usually come back with the first word will either be a yes or a no and then an explanation. I don't rely on this very much, but it does go out and gather enough information from sources to come to what they think the consensus is. All right? So, question: do embryos show evolution? This was Google AI's answer. Yes. Embryology is considered evidence of evolution because it shows that embryos of different species often share similar features during early development, indicating a common ancestry between them, even if the adult organisms look very different. Is this deceptive? I think it is. Along with everything else we've talked about, this is week 16. We have not, by any means, exhausted what we could go into. But we've talked about a very wide variety and differing kinds of evidence. Would you think that, would that be fair to say that we've done very different kinds of evidence and tried to look at it? And hopefully I've looked at it honestly to just try to see what it says and then come to a conclusion that what do I think or you think it means? All right, that's been what I've tried to do. I am not going to go into any more kinds of what I call external evidence for this class. That's the last one I'm going to actually speak of. But I am going to talk a little bit about a couple of things next week and do a summation, and then we're going to watch a rather long video that I think you are finally ready to understand. The video is still a section of a longer one, but it's going to be 20 minutes. And if I can remember, I'm going to bring popcorn. Okay? So anybody that's watching this at home and you're not here, come next week for the popcorn and the summation.
Next week.
Huh?
Next week.
Yeah. Probably if I brought donuts, we'd have more people in every day, right? Or something.
I thought that was the Hook's job.
Yeah.
That wasn't.
I know, and they're not.
Then they're not here.
David never.
So anyway, we're going to do a little bit of a summation, very briefly mention the different kinds of evidences that we touched on. We're going to do an explanation of something called the first and second law of thermodynamics, which is important. I got your attention. All right? Just so that you understand, because this video we're going to talk about is going to touch on several of the things that we talked about during these classes, and in the meantime also mention the first and second laws of thermodynamics. All right? Then the following week, if everything goes correctly, we're going to begin our journey on, okay, What do we believe? Do we believe that the evidence points towards a designer and in mind, or does the evidence point towards an evolutionary process that was mindless? And I know that my conclusion is, and I hope yours, is that there was a mind behind it. So the second part of this question in 2 weeks is going to start to be answered by, okay, what is that mind? Because there's a lot of people that think a lot of different things about what that mind is. And they don't automatically always think that it's the God of the Bible. So is there a way we can show that what we think about being God of the Bible has evidence in and of itself to show why we believe it? That, I think, is actually the more important question than what we've been doing for the last 16 weeks. All right?